from the Pacific theater. Now there's nothing stopping them from going into Australia, and at that point, the war would probably have been lost. What did we...
Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts into 1,000 parts, divide on man and make imaginary poussins. Think when we talk of horses that you see them printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings.
De roses blanches se sont fanées samedi, comme la fin de notre histoire. Je c'est dur d'y croire, pourtant j'oublierai.
Davies was never much of a student. On June 9th, 1969, Davies' last day of 4th grade, he stood nervously behind all his other classmates to receive that dreaded tan envelope, his report card. When Mrs. Baxter, his teacher, got to him, her wrinkled tan face slumped in silent, impenetrable disapproval. She towered over him in her red wool dress as her hand slowly stretched the tan report card envelope down to where he stood. As soon as it was within his reach, he snatched it out of her hand and shuffled out the door. He did not bother to look back at the classroom, empty, but for the 21 neatly ordered desks and a somewhat slouched Mrs. Baxter, whose knees, as soon as Davies turned away, had given out, forcing her to cling onto her brown teacher's podium to keep from falling to the floor. Had he looked back, he would have seen poor old Baxter's overly mascaraed left eye, batting open and closed, out of her control, as she allowed her face to form into a sort of snarl at little Davies. Davies sloppily folded the report card and shoved it in his pocket as soon as he was out the door. All 6 of them sat around the white-tiled dinner table that night. Davies' younger sister, Amy, 8, and his 2 older brothers, Ron, 15, and Duke, 17, as well as his father and mother. There was a lot of commotion that night, as their neighbors, the Palagins, were fighting valiantly to repossess their cat, Martha. Martha had climbed into the Palagins' apple tree at around 3 that afternoon, and had perched quite contentedly on one of the tree's thinner branches ever since. Meanwhile, more and more Palagins gathered beneath Martha, at first attempting to woo her down, and eventually resorting to shouting at Martha. Martha did not seem particularly interested in this event, nor did she seem particularly uninterested. Amy had been quick to join the Palagins in their quest, shrieking her heart out at Martha, who batted her tail ever so slightly whenever it was Amy's turn to yell, point, scream, and jump at her from down below. Amy had made quite the game of it, managing to flail her arms while hopping and screaming as well. The others in the rescue mission were only really speaking loudly compared to Amy. Amy had been made to come in for dinner ever so begrudgingly by Mrs. Edward, and was now making protests about why she should be allowed to go back out and help poor Martha. Mrs. Edward was having none of this, as she served the family their clam chowder soup and crab cakes. When Ron opened the door of the pantry, Mrs. Edward swiveled toward him and instructed him that he did not need any salt. Ron, pouting, slowly closed the pantry door and slumped into his seat. Through all of this commotion, Davies had sat in his usual seat next to the window, staring wistfully out at the sea that was only a few yards beyond their house. The report card still sat crumpled in his pocket, but he had long forgotten about that tan envelope, wrinkled Mrs. Baxter, and the long hours spent switching between staring at the clock and at the large, dark gray tiles of the floor. He had spent the afternoon in absolute bliss, watching the crabbers. Crabbing was what it was all about. It was how all the men on Smith Island made their money. It was practical and industrious. It was real work involving a real boat and real crabs. Not like this phony business at school where some old woman would drown on for hours, stopping only to scold her pupils. I before E, except after C, Clyde. We did this last week, moron. I'm being nice about it this time. You will not get away with this next year in the 5th grade. Davies loved crabbing. He loved getting up before dawn to dress in his hand-me-down green overalls. He loved grasping the wire handle of his bucket as he helped his father carry the supplies to the boat. He loved the feeling of the boat gliding through the water, of being able to watch their progress as the buckets filled with crabs. Fine. This is fine. Mr. Edwards nodded slightly as he squinted down at Ron's report card.
Math shouldn't be C. Get B next time. He let out a gargled huff as he handed Ron's report card back to him with another slight nod. Then he really sighed, loudly. His face settled into a scowl. He closed his eyes. All right, Davies, give me your worst. Davies' arm shook as he reached, ever so slowly, into his khaki pocket and produced that dreadful tan envelope. He unfolded it painstakingly, scanning the room desperately for any way to waste time. Maybe the Paladins would knock, or maybe the stove would catch fire, or maybe— Now! Davies handed his father the report card. Mr. Edwards scowled down at it. Mrs. Baxter had written on the back, in perfect cursive, "Poor student. Quite stupid. Reading ability very low." Mr. Edwards' scowl deepened. He sliced the envelope open with his pocket knife and took the piece of paper out that had been inside. He unfolded it. Math, F. English, F. History, C. Art, F. Gym, B. Science, B. Mr. Edwards scanned it silently, huffed, then returned the paper to its envelope and handed it to Mrs. Edward. "And Amy?" His mood lifted. Though missing her 2 front teeth, Amy grinned. She sat up very straight and handed her father a perfectly crisp pan envelope that had been sitting on her lap. Mr. Edwards smiled when he looked at his daughter's report card. Straight A's.